It began on a frozen January morning in 1977 on the corner of Kutuzovsky Prospect, one of the most heavily surveilled streets in Moscow. A middle-aged engineer stood alone near a bus stop, holding a small, cheap paperback book. The man's name was Adolf Georgievich Tokachev, a senior scientist at the Soviet Military Aviation Research Center NIIP, Scientific Research Institute of Radar. To the CIA, he would become one of the most extraordinary volunteer agents in the history of the Cold War. But on that morning, he was simply a man taking a risk so great that failure meant execution. Tokachev approached an American diplomat's car, one the KGB constantly followed, and slipped a handwritten note through the window. Inside, he pleaded for the CIA to meet him. He claimed he had access to classified Soviet radar and weapons systems. His motives, as later revealed in declassified operational cables, were a complex mix of moral outrage against the Soviet state and a desire to strike back after decades of repression against his family. The CIA ignored him. They believed it was a trap. The KGB often used dangles, fake volunteers designed to entrap foreign intelligence officers. Moscow was considered denied territory, the most dangerous place on earth to run a spy. But the notes kept coming. In 1978, Tokachev made several more attempts, approaching U.S. diplomats under the noses of KGB surveillance teams, something considered nearly impossible. Each note was desperate, detailed, and filled with technical insight that no ordinary citizen could know. Finally, after months of internal debate at CIA headquarters in Langley, and after verifying details inside his letters through satellite intelligence, the CIA made a decision. This was no trap. This man was real. In January 1979, the CIA's Moscow station finally established covert contact. The operation was codenamed simply under internal directives related to Soviet air defense intelligence, but Tokachev soon earned an informal, legendary title inside Langley. The billion-dollar spy, because the intelligence he would deliver was later estimated to save the United States over $2 billion in defense research. What followed would be a masterclass in espionage tradecraft. Microdots, concealed cameras, hollowed-out pens, dead drops, disguised kits, and some of the most dangerous operational meetings ever held on Soviet soil. But behind every risk was one chilling truth. Tokachev was living two lives so completely that he sometimes signed notes under false Americanized names he invented to protect himself. According to CIA debriefs, the lie became so deep he sometimes referred to himself by those aliases even when alone. He was becoming a man with two identities, and in Moscow, that meant death was always a step behind him. Soon, Tokachev's secret work would accelerate, and the KGB would begin to sense that someone inside IIP was leaking the crown jewels of Soviet air power. By the spring of 1979, the CIA had confirmed what their analysts in Langley almost couldn't believe. Adolf Tokachev had access to the heart of the Soviet Union's most secret military technologies. He worked inside an IIP, the institute responsible for radar systems on Soviet fighters like the MiG-23, MiG-25, and the still-developing MiG-29. This was the crown of Soviet air defense science. But operating a spy in Moscow, the most security-obsessed city in the world, was nearly impossible. Every American diplomat was followed by KGB surveillance teams. Every movement, every car, every face watched. So the CIA designed a covert system suited for a city where a spy could die for a single mistake. Tokachev and his handlers used a modified Buster camera, a tiny CIA-designed device hidden inside a pen or small container. Tokachev would slip documents from his institute during lunch breaks, bring them home, and photograph them page by page. He later admitted in a debrief, "I photographed documents in the kitchen while my family slept in the next room. The danger was unimaginable." If caught with those documents, he would be executed under Article 64 treason. The CIA, recognizing the unprecedented value of his intelligence, pushed to improve his tools. They gave him disguised communications gear, short-range burst transmitters, and concealment devices embedded in everyday objects like matchboxes and key holders. But even with these tools, meetings in Moscow were a nightmare. KGB surveillance was a constant shadow. CIA officers used brush passes, brief shoulder-to-shoulder encounters in public places that lasted less than a second. Pin handed off, a note tucked into a glove, an object dropped and replaced. Each meeting required days of preparation. Surveillance detection routes, timed crosswalk changes, coordinated bus stops. sudden detours, cover stories involving embassy errands, misdirection through crowds. Tokachev understood the risk better than anyone. He told his CIA handlers that he expected to die, but he insisted on continuing. His hatred of the Soviet regime ran deep. His wife's family had suffered brutally during Stalin's purges, and the bitterness never left him. The intelligence he provided shocked American analysts. He delivered specifications for Soviet radar systems, missile guidance algorithms, and the weaknesses of fighter jet avionics. These insights allowed U.S. engineers to design countermeasures years before the aircraft even entered service. Declassified CIA memos later concluded, no other single agent during the Cold War provided more valuable intelligence on Soviet aviation. But the KGB was not blind. By 1980, they suspected that something was wrong inside NIIP. Young engineers were questioned. Background checks were reopened. Sweeping internal investigations were launched. KGB surveillance units around a U.S. embassy increased their rotations. And most alarming of all, the KGB created a new counterintelligence directive focused on the possibility of a volunteer spy, someone offering information without recruitment. Tokachev fit that profile perfectly. Yet he kept going. He once told his handler during a meeting at a Moscow bus stop, "If I disappear, assume the worst. But until then, we must work." The danger was tightening like a noose, but the flow of documents continued. By 1981, Adolf Tokachev had already transformed American understanding of Soviet air defense technology. Engineers at the Pentagon were rewriting manuals, redesigning radar jammers, and preparing U.S. pilots for capabilities they previously could only guess at. His intelligence had become so strategic that some in Langley privately debated whether he was the most important spy of the entire Cold War. And then he made a request that shook the CIA's Moscow station. Tokachev asked for lethal poison. Not to use on anyone else, he wanted it for himself. In multiple notes and face-to-face meetings, he explained the same logic. If the KGB ever arrested him, torture and execution were guaranteed. He refused to be interrogated, refused to risk exposing CIA officers, and refused to break under pressure. He wanted a way to die quickly, silently, without giving the Soviets the satisfaction of extracting secrets or inflicting humiliation. For the CIA, this was an agonizing dilemma. Providing suicide devices violated official policy. But this was Moscow, the hardest battleground of espionage. And Tokachev was no ordinary asset. He had already taken risks beyond what most officers considered survivable. At first, Langley denied his request. But by late 1981, after months of him insisting he would quit without protection, the CIA relented. They provided a L-pill concealed inside a pen, a tiny dose of cyanide hidden inside a spring-loaded compartment. Declassified operational memos reveal that even this decision caused heated debate at the highest levels of the CIA. The risk of discovery was enormous, but so was the cost of losing him. Meanwhile, Tokachev's intelligence became even more explosive. He delivered blueprints for the MiG-29 and MiG-31 radar systems at a time when the aircraft themselves were still years from frontline deployment. He exposed Soviet attempts to counter American stealth technology. He revealed vulnerabilities in air-to-air missile guidance systems, data that U.S. analysts later said allowed the U.S. to maintain air dominance throughout the 1980s. And he did all of this alone, unaided, armed only with a camera and his own determination. But the KGB was tightening its grip. By 1982, surveillance around foreign embassies reached levels that even veteran CIA officers found unprecedented. New counterintelligence teams were activated. Traffic checkpoints appeared without warning. American cars were delayed, redirected, or boxed in by accidental civilian vehicles. Known CIA officers reported unusual, persistent tales. Inside IP, a quiet fear spread. The KGB's investigations focused on employees with access to sensitive avionics. Background checks were repeated. Workspaces were inspected without warning. Even social connections were monitored for anomalies. Tokachev felt the pressure too. In his notes, he wrote that the atmosphere at work had become suffocating, and he knew it was only a matter of time before suspicion found him. Still, he continued. During a covert meeting in 1983, as he handed over microfilm of yet another radar system, he told his CIA handler, "I cannot stop now. As long as I live, I will fight them." He said it calmly, standing in the cold Moscow air, as if he had already accepted his fate. But it was the CIA who would soon face a devastating blow, one that came not from Moscow, but from inside the United States. By 1983, Adolf Tokachev's intelligence had become one of the CIA's most guarded secrets. His reports shaped American fighter strategy, stealth development, and the electronic warfare doctrine of the entire decade. To protect him, the CIA built layers of compartmentalization. Only a small group inside Langley even knew his codename. But in the shadows, a breach was forming. Inside the United States, a disgruntled CIA case officer named Edward Lee Howard was being groomed for an assignment to Moscow. He had been trained in surveillance detection routes, dead drops, and the extremely rare tradecraft needed to operate in the USSR. But his life spun out of control. He failed polygraphs about drug use and was abruptly fired in 1983. And Howard was furious. According to declassified CIA and FBI files, Howard became a security threat almost immediately. He began drinking heavily and complaining openly that the CIA had ruined him. Intelligence later revealed that he kept notes from his Moscow training, notes that were supposed to be destroyed. In 1984, Howard defected to the Soviet Union. His defection was catastrophic. He carried knowledge of CIA methods, CIA officers, and most dangerously, CIA assets in Moscow, including detailed training related to the Tokachev operation. The FBI later concluded that Howard was one of the key triggers that alerted the KGB to a high-value American spy operating inside a Soviet aviation institute. But Howard was not the only leak. Another CIA officer, Aldrich Ames, began spying for the Soviet Union in 1985, driven by financial troubles and personal greed. Ames provided the KGB with lists of CIA assets, and although historians still debate which leak delivered the final blow, both Howard and Ames contributed to the noose tightening around Tokachev. Back in Moscow, the CIA station began seeing signs something was wrong. Surveillance became sharper, more coordinated, more aggressive. Cars were followed at impossible angles. Embassy staff were stopped randomly on streets. Brushed past locations that had been safe for years suddenly felt watched. CIA officers described the atmosphere as electric with danger. Tokachev sensed it too. In his final communications, he warned his handlers that the KGB had increased restrictions, unexpected searches, and mandatory document verifications inside an IIP. He wrote that simply moving between rooms in the institute now required justification. Yet he did not stop. He kept photographing classified blueprints, even as his hands shook from stress. He kept placing notes in dead drops, even as he reported KGB vans near his apartment. He worked faster, harder, believing time was running out. On June 9, 1985, the KGB made its move. After a routine operational meeting with his CIA handler, Tokachev was intercepted on the street by a KGB team and arrested. They had been waiting for him. The CIA didn't know it yet, but the operation was over. When Tokachev didn't appear at the next scheduled signal, the Moscow station sent tremors of warning back to Langley. Someone had betrayed them. Someone had given up their most valuable spy. The CIA would soon discover the horrifying truth, and the final days of Adolf Tokachev would reveal just how far the Soviet Union would go to break a man. Next comes the interrogation, the trial, and the final moments of the spy who changed the balance of the Cold War. When Adolf Tokachev vanished on June 9, 1985, the CIA's Moscow station hoped for a miracle. But inside the Soviet Union, there were no miracles for captured spies. The truth became clear when reports of an internal IIP purge leaked back to Langley. The KGB had him. Tokachev's arrest was swift and brutally efficient. KGB surveillance teams had monitored his movements for weeks, waiting for an operational meeting with his CIA handler to confirm the connection. When the brush pass occurred, they closed in. From that moment, his world became a steel box. The KGB took him to Lefortovo prison, the infamous high-security interrogation facility used for political prisoners, traitors, and foreign agents. Declassified Soviet-era records describe Lefortovo as a place of isolation, disorientation, and relentless psychological pressure. The CIA would later learn small fragments of his treatment through indirect Soviet sources. Tokachev was kept in a sealed cell, with lights that never dimmed. He was interrogated for months, sometimes multiple times a day. The Soviets didn't need him to reveal U.S. secrets. They wanted details of his motives, his tradecraft, and every technique used by the CIA in Moscow. But above all, they wanted to humiliate him. Their greatest anger came from the scale of damage he had inflicted. Soviet military intelligence calculated that his leaks compromised an entire generation of radar and missile programs. Some had to be redesigned from scratch. Billions of rubles were wasted. He had become one of the most damaging spies in Soviet history. Under questioning, Tokachev admitted he had passed documents to the CIA. He explained his hatred for the Soviet regime, referencing decades of repression against his wife's family. He made no attempt to deny responsibility, but he refused to implicate anyone else. Not a single CIA officer's name ever left his lips. The L-pill, the cyanide capsule the CIA had hidden in a pen, was never used. Soviet reports indicate that the KGB confiscated all his personal belongings immediately after the arrest. They found cameras, concealment devices, and foreign currency hidden in his apartment, confirming his espionage beyond doubt. In September 1985, the Soviet Supreme Court formally charged him with treason. The trial was secret. There was no defense in any meaningful sense. The outcome was predetermined. In early 1986, Adolf Tokachev was executed. The exact method remains classified in surviving Soviet records, but it is widely accepted that he was shot, the standard punishment for high treason under Soviet law. His family was not permitted a funeral. They received only a brief notification that he had been punished under Article 64. Meanwhile, in Langley, the CIA conducted internal reviews. When Aldrich Ames's betrayal was confirmed years later, so with the magnitude of the loss. In after-action assessments, senior CIA officials wrote, "Tokachev gave us a decade of advantage. His information shaped U.S. radar countermeasures, stealth technology, and air combat planning for years. Despite his tragic end, the intelligence he provided altered the strategic balance of the Cold War." But the story does not end with his execution, because in Washington, a final reckoning awaited the men who betrayed him. The execution of Adolf Tokachev in 1986 marked the end of the CIA's most successful and most devastating penetration of the Soviet military-industrial complex. But inside Langley, the loss triggered a volcanic internal question. Who betrayed him? For years, the answer remained clouded. The KGB had been unusually precise in intercepting him. They knew tradecraft patterns. They anticipated brush passes. Someone had taught the Soviets exactly how the CIA ran agents in Moscow. It wasn't until the early 1990s that the truth finally surfaced. The first traitor identified, Edward Lee Howard. In 1985, just months after Tokachev's arrest, U.S. counterintelligence units began reviewing the case of Edward Lee Howard, the fired CIA officer who had defected the year before. Howard had been trained specifically for Moscow operations, and that training included the procedures used with Tokachev. Because Howard fled to the USSR, the CIA could not interrogate him. But over time, FBI and CIA analysts reconstructed his movements, phone calls, and security violations. These findings were strengthened after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and former KGB officers privately confirmed that Howard had provided information that helped identify a high-value American agent in Moscow. Howard lived out the rest of his life in Russia, granting occasional interviews but never admitting the extent of his betrayal. In 2002, he died in Russia under unclear circumstances. Some reports said a fall, others claimed alcohol-related complications. He never returned to the United States. The second traitor, Aldrich Ames. The most definitive proof came later. In 1994, the FBI arrested Aldrich Hazen Ames, a senior CIA counterintelligence officer who had been secretly spying for the KGB and later FSB since 1985. Ames had access to nearly every ongoing CIA operation against the Soviets, including the file marking Tokachev as the CIA's highest value asset in Moscow. During plea negotiations, Ames admitted he had provided the Soviets with names, operational details, and identities of CIA assets, resulting in multiple executions inside the USSR. Investigators concluded that Ames's betrayal directly exposed Tokachev's identity, methods, and CIA connection. Ames was sentenced to life in prison without parole, where he remains today. The CIA's internal reckoning. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, U.S. intelligence engaged in candid internal reviews. Declassified portions of these assessments described Tokachev's contributions as unmatched in technical value, strategically transformative, equivalent to a decade of U.S. research, American pilots who flew in the late 1980s and early 1990s benefited directly from his intelligence. The countermeasures that protected U.S. aircraft, especially against MiG radars, were shaped by the documents he risked everything to deliver. How history remembers him. When the CIA declassified portions of his operational file in 2015, historians were stunned by the scale of his impact. His work influenced U.S. stealth aircraft development, electronic warfare systems, radar-evading tactics, NATO air combat doctrine, the Pentagon's long-term strategic planning. Tokachev had stood alone, armed with nothing but a camera, determination, and hatred for a regime that had destroyed generations of his family. He knew the price. He paid it. And the West gained an advantage that lasted long after his death. Today, he is remembered inside intelligence circles as one of the most consequential spies of the Cold War. A man who lived a lie so deep, so dangerous, and so committed that even after his execution, the world he changed continued to shift around his shadow. His story ends in a Moscow prison, but his legacy stretches across decades of global history.